grey spring sky hung over the Tower of London. The air held its breath. So did she. Anne Boleyn stood on the scaffold. A lady stepped forward and tied the blindfold. Perhaps, in that darkness, her mind wandered. To dances, letters, promises. To the king who once adored her. To the crown he gave her, and the one he would now take away. A fairy tale turned execution. Anne knelt, and perhaps she thought, it wasn't meant to end like this. It began quietly, as ruin so often does. A casual word, a sidelong glance, then the sudden, shocking arrest of Mark Smeaton, the court musician, torn from court and swept into Cromwell's grip, accused of a monstrous crime, adultery with the Queen. The news rippled through the court like a venomous current. Then came Sir Henry Norris, a man close to the King's own heart, and Francis Weston, another of the King's privy chamber. The net was widening, tightening. On May 2nd, 1536, Anne Boleyn herself was arrested. The charges, pronounced by men who had once bowed before her, including her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, must have felt like a cruel theatrical flourish. Treason, adultery, incest. The accusations were as lurid as they were unbelievable. A desperate scramble to find a cause for her downfall, to sever the knot of a marriage that had, for years, been both Henry VIII's obsession and his greatest triumph. She had once walked this path in glory, the Thames glittering beneath her barge, banners fluttering, crowds cheering as she was rowed to the Tower for her coronation, not as a prisoner, but as a queen-to-be. That day she had smiled, radiant and triumphant. Now the same river bore her in silence. She was taken by barge to the Tower, the very place from which her coronation procession had embarked with such pomp and glory just 3 years prior. The river, once a pathway to power, now carried her to a prison. As she stepped onto the muddy bank, the irony must have been a bitter taste on her tongue. "It is too good for me," she reportedly said of her grand lodging in the royal palace within the Tower complex, her voice perhaps trembling with a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, terrible understanding. Inside, the days blurred into a haze of fear and interrogation. Her ladies, once her confidants, were now her jailers and worse, her spies. Every sigh, every whispered prayer, every desperate cry could be twisted, weaponized. She pleaded for a sight of the king, for a chance to clear her name. But Henry remained a phantom, his love turned to ice, his once burning desire now a cold, calculated fury. The accusations piled up, not just adultery with the unfortunate courtiers, but a monstrous, unthinkable liaison with her own brother, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford. The charge of incest was a masterstroke of malice, designed to utterly defile her reputation, to make her a pariah, a witch in the eyes of God and man. The trials that followed were a macabre spectacle, a foregone conclusion. On May 12th, the 4 alleged lovers, Smeaton, Norris, Weston and Brereton, another gentleman of the Privy Chamber, were tried at Westminster Hall. The evidence was flimsy, based largely on Smeaton's confession, likely extracted under torture, or the promise of mercy, a mercy that never came. The men were condemned, their fates sealed. 3 days later, on May 15th, Anne and George Boleyn faced their peers in the Great Hall of the Tower. A scaffold had already been erected outside, a chilling premonition of what was to come. Anne stood before a jury of 26 noblemen, among them her own uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, who presided over the proceedings with a grim impartiality, no doubt a cruel twist of the knife. Each juror, a pawn in a larger game. The charges were read, a litany of betrayal and perversion. Anne, composed, despite the enormity of her situation, pleaded not guilty in a clear, steady voice. She argued eloquently, dissected the flimsy evidence, exposed the contradictions. Her intellect still burned, even in the face of annihilation. She had used that same sharp mind to rise through the glittering chaos of court life. Years earlier, when Henry's attention turned to her, she did what no other woman dared. She refused him. "If you want my body," she had said, eyes steady and voice cool. "You must give me a crown." It had been a bold gambit, one born not of vanity, but of survival, and he had given it to her. "No one could accuse me but for malice," she is said to have declared, her voice ringing with indignation. But her words were unheard, her logic ignored. The verdict was predetermined, the sentence already written in the king's mind. Guilty. George Boleyn next stood trial, defending himself with equal vigor. He challenged his accusers, scoffing at the notion of his sister ever saying to him, as alleged, that the king was not able to meddle with any woman, a remark supposedly uttered by Anne in a moment of frustration, and twisted into an accusation of incestuous boastfulness. Yet his eloquence, like his sister's, availed him nothing. He was found guilty. The condemnations were swift, brutal. The men, including George Boleyn, were sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered, but this was later commuted to beheading. Anne was condemned to death at the king's pleasure, either by burning or beheading. In a gesture of twisted mercy, Henry decreed that she should die by the sword, a more noble end than the axe, and ordered a master swordsman from Calais to be brought over for the task. The days between sentence and execution were a torment, a period of agonizing waiting. Anne Boleyn, despite moments of despair, displayed a remarkable resilience, even a grim humor. She spoke of her impending death, reportedly remarking to her ladies, "I hear the executioner is very good, and I have a little neck." Her composure, as recorded by chroniclers, was unsettling to some, admirable to others. It was the composure of a woman who had faced down the world and was now ready to face death. On May 17th, George Boleyn and the other condemned men faced their end on Tower Hill. One by one, they stepped onto the scaffold, their lives extinguished in a brutal display of royal power. George Boleyn, ever defiant, used his final moments to proclaim his innocence and his faith, a testament to his courage in the face of such injustice. 2 days later, on May 19th, 1536, the morning dawned grey and damp, matching the mood that hung heavy over the tower. A scaffold had been erected within the tower precincts, on the green, chosen to ensure a more private, less clamorous execution than Tower Hill, though still witnessed by a select, grim crowd. Among them were the Duke of Suffolk, the Duke of Richmond, Henry Fitzroy, Henry VIII's illegitimate son, and Thomas Cromwell, the architect of her downfall, who watched with cold satisfaction. Inside the tower, the stillness was of a different kind, breathless, intimate, and final. Not the damp fog that rolled off the Thames, but a deeper chill that clung to the walls and settled into the soul. It had crept into Anne Boleyn's bones over 17 long days. She had once ruled from golden halls, her every whim a command, her smile a sun around which the court revolved. Now, her world had shrunk to a single, echoing chamber. The silks, the suitors, the music, all gone. Only silence remained, thick, suffocating, merciless. Anne Boleyn, dressed in a loose grey damask gown trimmed with fur and a mantle of ermine, walked with serene dignity toward her fate. Beneath the gown, a red petticoat, the colour of martyrdom, flickered at her steps. In her hands, she clutched a small prayer book. Her eyes, once ablaze with wit and power, now held only quiet resignation. She mounted the scaffold, her steps steady. Perhaps her thoughts drifted, not to courtly feasts or royal triumphs, but to a quiet chamber lit by morning sun, to the soft weight of her daughter in her arms. Elizabeth, small and pink and fierce, grasping at her finger, a girl the king had not wanted. But to Anne, she was everything. "You will be greater than us all," she had once whispered into that tiny ear. "You will be queen." She spoke calmly, her voice clear, addressed to the small crowd. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never. And to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord. Her words were carefully chosen, a last act of defiance and protection. To condemn the king would have jeopardized her daughter, Elizabeth's future. To acknowledge her guilt would have been a lie. So, she spoke ambiguously, praising the king while leaving her innocence unspoken. She knelt, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon, perhaps seeing beyond the grey walls, to the life she had once known, the power she had wielded, the child she would leave behind. The executioner, a master of his craft, stepped forward with the heavy two-handed sword. He asked her to remove her cap. She did, revealing her long, dark hair, which she tucked beneath a linen coif. Then, at his request, she allowed herself to be blindfolded. "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul," she whispered, her voice barely audible. With a final, chilling act of deception, the executioner called out, "Where is my sword?" to distract her. And in that moment, while she stood still and sightless, the blade descended. A collective gasp. Her head was severed cleanly, falling to the straw-covered platform. One of her ladies-in-waiting stepped forward, wrapping the head and body in white linen. There was no grand funeral, no procession, no elaborate tomb. Her body was carried to the nearby chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the tower walls, and buried in an unmarked grave beside her brother George, their brief, tragic lives ending in anonymity. Within days, Henry VIII married Jane Seymour, Anne's own lady-in-waiting, the ink on her death warrant barely dry. The speed was shocking, a clear signal that Anne had been an obstacle, not a beloved wife whose loss would be mourned. Her name was erased from court life, her portraits removed, her memory blackened by scandal. Yet history, like the Thames, flows on, eventually revealing what lies beneath. Anne Boleyn, once condemned as a harlot and a traitor, would not be remembered for her alleged crimes, but for her courage, her wit, and the indelible mark she left on England. Her daughter, Elizabeth, against all odds, would rise to become one of England's greatest monarchs, a living testament to Anne's spirit. A queen who would never marry, perhaps shaped by her mother's fate. The shadow of the blade may have fallen upon Anne Boleyn, but her echo, defiant and enduring, would reverberate through the ages, not just in stone and memory, but in the crown her daughter would one day wear. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video. It helps us immensely. To explore more stories like this one, click the video on screen now and subscribe to walk with us into the next forgotten tale.